what is it now, 4 years, now that it's a new year, and it's just failure after failure. I mean, the United States itself, right? How many times have we heard about the famous cigar assassination attempt with Fidel Castro? So for us to just pop in there and take this guy and put him before justice, I think it's really phenomenal. And another thing, to compare it to the Castro situation, when Fidel Castro died, he died an old man of natural causes, facing no justice, and he died a multimillionaire. So as Cubans, we rejoice that we survived him, but it wasn't this kind of joy. The Venezuelans are celebrating not just because he was captured, but he's going to face real justice. He's going to get due process in a court of law. We're going to hear about his crimes, and we're not going to hear the totality of his crimes. We're going to hear about the crimes relevant to the United States, right? We're going to hear about the drug trafficking. We're not going to hear about 14-year-old Juliver Roa, who was gunned down and murdered, I think, in 2014 because he was walking near a protest. Those stories, they're just not relevant to the court of law, and we want a conviction, so we want a clear legal, we want the prosecution to be on the ball. But they're getting due process. They're getting their day in court, and that to me is absolutely phenomenal. That is, the best execution of international law that we've seen in a very long time, probably since, the Yugoslavia International Court proceedings, or, what we had with the leaders of the Rwandan genocide. It's very rare that you get to take one of these guys and put him in a court.
Yes. Are we going to be involved in a multi-year quagmire?
I don't see why. We're not there now. We popped in, we popped out. And like I said, at this point, it looks to me like the plan is to let the socialists eat each other up alive. The Trump administration is being very clear that they're not going to go in there and install Maria Corina Machado. They're not, we're going to go in and take the oil assets that Chavez expropriated, because those are ours. But we're not, this isn't Iraq. It's a completely different society. It's a completely different problem. In some ways, arguably a more difficult nation to rebuild because, people who are starving. Like when we invaded Iraq, the Iraqis weren't starving. They were poor and oppressed, but they weren't eating garbage or new animals the way that Venezuelans were forced to do in the past decade. So that's something that needs to be rebuilt, but that's not our problem, and it's clearly, it's just a different situation. I don't expect us to have some sort of long-term military presence there outside of anything that we need to do to, reobtain the property that is American property.
Were you surprised to hear the president speak of Machado? He said, I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. Again, this is the Nobel Prize winner who dedicated her prize to President Trump. She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect. Were you surprised at that?
I wasn't surprised because Trump has a way of saying things in sort of the most offensive way possible. I think I understand what he's trying to say, but he said it very incorrectly, and it's especially sad because during his first term in office, he empowered Elliot Abrams, who's this neocon who hates him, to basically denigrate Maria Corina Machado. He was on TV trashing her and supporting Juan Guaido, who's a socialist. So Trump has a lot of ground to make up with Machado. He's been really unfair to her, but I think the core of his point is that Machado commands no respect from the Venezuelan military. And the only people who have guns in Venezuela, meaning the only people with any political power, is the military. The military is a drug trafficking organization now run by Vladimir Padrino and by Diosdado Cabello since Maduro was taken out. And if you just plop Machado in Caracas, like, she has the popular support of the civilians who are unarmed and starving. The majority of Venezuelans love her, and she was always the first choice for them, and not Juan Guaido, right? And not, Capriles and all these other opposition socialists. But that's not enough. You need the guns. You need the military to be part of the rebuilding process, and we're not there yet. So I think what Trump was trying to say is if we just parachute Maria Corina Machado into Venezuela right now, they're just going to shoot her in the head, and that's it. And then we'll really have a quagmire for the next 20 years.
Okay, all right, so last question on this point. So people would say, that another Hugo Chavez is going to rise up, someone worse. Why do you not think someone way worse? Well, I know you mentioned they eat each other and all that, but could this not get way, way worse? Why are we hopeful that it will get better?
Because at this point, I think the military operation that we executed was so terrifying that if they try to pull a fast one, the entire structure of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela is going to be utterly destroyed. And possibly the entire Venezuelan military infrastructure will be obliterated for generations. Like that's the kind of military might we exercise, right? We didn't go in there, it wasn't blink in with a task force, right? It was the real bad guys went down, did their job, got out in a way that no other country can do. And so what that means is that any funny business on the part of the socialists, any attempts to repress further, is going to incur the wrath of a military that has now reminded the world that it is far superior to any other military power on earth. Forget Venezuela. That was something that Russia can't do against the Zelensky example. China certainly can't do anything like that. So there's no one left to protect the Venezuelan socialists. And I think they're smart enough to know that that's the case.
Like, are they going to keep running drug boats and stuff? Are they going to keep doing a ghost fleet of oil in Venezuela?
Well, there's reports that there was a last gas canal, that there was like a huge number of sanctioned oil boats that tried to get out. We'll see if that persists. They're going to have to do something to make money because Venezuela, the Venezuelan socialist regime fed itself through giving allies free oil, and in exchange for the free oil, they got political support. So from Cuba, they would give Cuba free oil, and then they got spies, and they got like espionage and military expertise. They gave oil to Russia. The Russians gave them their torture experts, and they built them the biggest political prison in the hemisphere. And then they gave the Chinese a bunch of money, a bunch of oil, and the Chinese gave them enough money to prop up the lavish lifestyle of the top socialists in the country. I mean, the people around Maduro, these are people that bought houses in Miami, that had like golden iPhones back when that was popular. They had really cushy lives for the past decade where we were watching these reports of Venezuelans eating dogs and stuff. And that was because China was paying for it. So they're going to have to find a way to fund that. I think the only option on the table right now is you're going to have to deal with ExxonMobil, you're going to have to deal with Trump. Otherwise, no one is going to come to save you. China wasn't there this weekend. Russia wasn't there this weekend. Iran was laughable at this point. So they got to come up with something.
Yep. The headline, let me just quote this. The headline of The Atlantic is, Trump threatens Venezuela's new leader, this is the vice president woman, with a fate worse than Maduro's. And he said if she doesn't do what's right, she's going to pay a very big price, probably bigger than Maduro. Like, you better fall in line. There's no other option for you. All right, what about China? So, two things. I read that 6 or 7 days ago, there was a monument to the Chinese people overlooking the Panama Canal that was taken down, and the Chinese authorities and delegation, whatever, were outraged at that. So there's something to speak of there. And then also, is it true that there was a Chinese delegation in Caracas the night before the operation?
Yes, so that was Maduro's last official event before getting yanked out of the country. And if you go to his Instagram, there's pictures of him with Xi Jinping's special envoy to Caracas. That was the last thing he did before he got arrested. And those diplomats presumably were in Caracas when this happened, unless they flew out that day. So it's a tremendous humiliation for the Chinese. They're certainly taking it that way. Like, if you read Chinese state media, they're acting like, this is the worst thing since Hitler. And that's because they can see how disempowered they are. And the flagrant disrespect to China's military power here, right? Because we know that the Chinese are heavily invested in trying to get Venezuelan oil. They buy a ton of sanctioned Venezuelan oil. Presumably the People's Liberation Army has a role in protecting that business, and Trump doesn't care. He did not care. He he sent the operation in there with the threat that the Cuban military, the Chinese military, and the Russian military could have done something to protect Maduro. And the only people who did anything were the Cubans. Apparently the majority of the people killed in the operation were Cuban agents. The Chinese did nothing. So that's to answer your second question. Your first question is one of my favorite stories so far of the past month, which is there was a statue honoring Chinese-Panamanian friendship off of the Panama Canal and this rogue right-wing Latina mayor just demolished it. She unilaterally called to just take it apart. And the reason was it was decaying. It's a very old statue. It was very poorly maintained. And that was the nominal reason for removing it. But, this is a conservative mayor who clearly wants no Chinese communist presence in her town. So she just took it down. And she said, we don't want to be colonized by the Chinese. And it caused a major international incident where even the president of Panama, Molino, had to come out and apologize to the Chinese. And Molino's a conservative. He's he's trying his best to be friends with Trump. He won as a conservative, and he's still, it's so shocking to the Chinese that how you're going to demolish our amazing, decaying statue, that he had to go apologize. So it was really the feat of this one mayor. Just goes to show you all politics is local. There's no election that's too small to make a difference on the world stage.
That's great. We spent a good amount of time in the last hour talking about the Monroe Doctrine and the reinforcing of it. And we quoted John Kerry in 2012 when he literally went around the world and said, quote, the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. Not wild. So can you speak to that for a minute? And then we can go in any direction, but I'm fascinated, again, by China's Belt and Road Initiative efforts in Venezuela and Latin and South America, which I presume now are over, will be.
Yeah, they're on life support. They've got Brazil, which is a very big, piece on the chessboard. But Brazil has presidential elections this year, and Bolsonaro's son is running against Lula, and it's very possible that he could win. But outside of Brazil, it's very little. It's Nicaragua, it's Cuba. Colombia has an election this year, too, so their leftists is getting kicked out. So Cuba is struggling. On the Monroe Doctrine, what I would say is the point of the Monroe Doctrine, and it only works if this is the way that real life is that the countries of the Western Hemisphere, the